If you would remain standing for the reading of the teaching text this morning from Luke 19, verses 11 through 27. While they were listening to this, he went on to tell them a parable, because he was near Jerusalem, and the people thought that the kingdom of God was going to appear at once. A man of noble birth went to a distant country to have himself appointed king, and then to return. So he called 10 of his servants and gave them 10 minas. "Put this money to work," he said, "until I come back." But his subjects hated him and sent a delegation after him to say, "We don't want this man to be our king." He was made king, however, and returned home. Then he sent for the servants to whom he had given the money in order to find out what they had gained with it. The first one came to him and said, "Sir, your mina has earned 10 more." "Well done, my good servant," his master replied. "Because you've been trustworthy in a very small matter, take charge of 10 cities." The second came and said, "Sir, your mina has earned 5 more." His master answered, "You take charge of 5 cities." And then another servant came and said, "Sir, here is your mina. I've kept it laid away in a piece of cloth. I was afraid of you because you are a hard man. You take out what you did not put in and reap what you did not sow." His master replied, "I will judge you by your own words, you wicked servant. You knew, did you, that I am a hard man, taking out what I did not put in and reaping what I did not sow? Why then didn't you put my money on deposit so that when I came back I could have collected it with interest?" Then he said to those standing by, "Take this mina away from him and give it to the one who has 10 minas." "Sir," they said, "he already has 10. He replied, "I tell you that to everyone who has, more will be given. But as for the one who has nothing, even what they have will be taken away. But those enemies of mine who did not want me to be king over them, bring them here and kill them in front of me." This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated.
Well, we're ending a series today called The God That You Wish That You Knew. The God That You Wish That You Knew. And I want to talk to you this morning as we close this series about a God who sees your potential. A God who sees your potential. I want you to just turn to your neighbor and say, God sees more in you than I do. Well, let me ask you a question. This is an important question. I'm going to put it on the screen for you. How do you know if you are living a fruitful life? How do you know? If you get in your car, go on I-70, you're heading to the mountains, you're going to see some signs that are going to tell you that you are making progress. But when you're trying to live a fruitful life, a life that contributes something, does something, what are the markers? What are the signposts? How do you know that you're making progress? How do you know if you're living a fruitful life? And I want to give you this morning 3 keys to living a fruitful life that come from knowing God. 3 keys. You ready? I'm going to jump right in. Here's the first thing. Number 1, you and I have to figure out how to anoint God as king over your life. Anoint God as king over your life. Here's how Jesus opens the parable. He sets the scene of a king, a man of noble birth, went to a distant country to have himself appointed king and then to return. Now, if you know the context of this, what was happening is Jesus was recounting something that happened with Herod, who was the king of the region. And when he wanted to take possession of that region, he had to travel. He had to leave where he was and go to Rome and receive his kingship. And so everyone said, I see what you're saying, Jesus. Yes, you're doing the same thing. And Jesus is setting up a contrast between his kingdom, his rulership, his leadership, and Herod. Because if you go backwards in the Gospel of Luke to Luke chapter 2, the narrative about Christmas and the first Christmas, you know that Herod did what with all the babies? Killed all the babies, right? Slaughtered them all. And he's contrasting. He's saying God's not like Herod. Herod was a selfish king. Herod used his authority and his rule to benefit himself. God's not like that. Different kind of king. God, the king, is not selfish. What he does is he shares his life. He, in effect, gives your life, a portion of his control. He bequeaths it to you. So when we're talking about God as king, what we're saying is that God is in charge. I understand as Americans we have an opposition to kings. We were founded as a country in opposition to kings, and so we wrestle, honestly, culturally, with someone having any kind of sovereignty or control over our lives. So here's what we've done. Instead of saying, we don't want a political sovereign, we have decided to adopt the sovereignty of the self. And the secular story that we've lived in has not worked out so well. Everyone kind of sees that it's empty. And so what we have done collectively as a culture is we've moved on. Instead of the secular story, we've moved on to my story. It's my story. I'm in charge. I'm the captain of my fate. I'm the captain of my soul. Now, I've got a question for you from Dr. Phil. Are you ready? I think it's apropos. How's that working for you? That understanding that I'm in control of my life, that I'm the sovereign person over my own life, here's what it hasn't done. It has not succeeded in erasing human frailty. You still recognize that I have weakness and I don't know what to do with it. So ask yourself a series of questions here. Do you have the levels of joy that you'd hope you would have by now? Are you filled with a peace that you can't fully describe? Is that what characterizes your life? Do you have a sense of self that's secure so you don't, in every interaction, you don't feel like you're risking yourself because you have a security from God's love? Do you tend to operate from a place of strength so that you don't need to take advantage of anybody? You don't need to power up on somebody. You have what you need. How is that working for you? You and I need someone greater than us leading us. So here's how Peter says it, same kind of phrase in his letter. He said, in your hearts, set apart Christ as Lord. I think what we need to do is we need to institute some kind of, I'm just going to call it a heart ceremony. You and I, we look into our interior world, we see how it's going there, we discern the need for someone greater than us to give us better leadership than we're currently giving ourselves, and we decide, Peter says, that we are going to allow that person to be Jesus. And so we need to have some kind of coronation ceremony in the heart. Wouldn't that be good if we instituted something like that? We, in our hearts, set apart Christ as Lord. Because in the parable, Jesus gives us three approaches to life. When you say that God is the king, there are three different approaches. Here they are. They're inside of the parable. I'm going to parse them out for you. Here's the first one. Because you can say God is king. You can go, that sounds great, Scott. But you can live like God's not there. You can, in other words, get what I can while I can. This is it, right? So Luke 19, verse 14. His subjects hated him. They sent a delegation after him to say, we don't want this man to be our king. God may be king, but he's not here. So what that means is I have to get what I can while I can. I'm not suggesting that you're some sort of hedonist. Maybe you are. I don't know. I'm just suggesting that you think, God's king, that's nice rhetoric. It's really up to me. I would argue that often Christians do this often. We all the time. We operate like practical atheists. You know what a practical atheist is? The atheists say there's no God. So we say, well, we know there's a God. Yes. But practically speaking, it's all up to me. I look inside myself. I look inside my interior world. I recognize the pain and the fear that I have, and I decide God's king, that sounds nice, but I decide no one's there, and so I have to get what I can while I can. Get what I can while I can. That's the first approach. Second approach in the parable is to decide to live cautiously and out of fear. So the king goes off and he gives these servants, one servant, he says, here's a mina, and another servant, here's a mina, and they do something with the money, and then he gives it to another servant. And verse 20, that other servant came to him and said, here is your mina. I've kept it laid away in a piece of cloth. I was afraid of you because you are a hard man. You take out what you did not put in, and you reap what you did not sow. In other words, that person lives with a mistaken view of God that isn't accurate. Have you read this parable before and thought, what this servant says right here is a description of what God is actually like? Yeah, he must be harsh and mean. Notice what he says. You take out what you did not put in. In other words, you are stingy, you're cheap, and you're harsh. That's what you're like, God. Now, is that the case? Many of us, that we read this and we go, man, maybe God's like that. Notice in the parable what Jesus says God is actually like. Here it is in verse 17, 18. Well done, my good servant. Master replied, because you've been trustworthy in a very small matter, generous, take charge of 10 cities. Second came, sir, your mind has earned 5 more. His master, take charge of 5 cities. This is someone, Jesus is painting a picture for us. God is very generous. So when you have this small conception of God, you live at the corner of fear and trepidation. I recognize this, that Christians often take this section right here of this parable, and we spiritualize it, and we say, what the servant did, sir, here's your mina, I've kept it laid away in a piece of cloth. Here's what we say. God, I've been faithful. I'm faithful. You can't make fruit come out of my life, God, but I've just faithfully taken. I'm faithful, God. You can't make a tree grow, God. Come on. Why are you putting that pressure on me? Missing the point that the nature of a tree is to grow. This is actually a cowardly version of the first thing where I get what I can because I think God's absent. Is I say, well, I'm too afraid. It's interesting to note the only group that's classified as wicked in this parable is this servant right here, verse 22. His master replied, I will judge you by your own words, you wicked servant. Word means willingly and knowingly bad, a dream, harmful, misuseful. And so the master says, the king says, well, if you thought I was like that, then what you should have done is you should have taken it, and literally the language reads, you should have taken it to the money changers' tables and given it to them, and at least it would gain interest. He says, what you did, though, is, he classifies it's wicked. Now, we got to pause here for a second. This is actually something an American person would do. We would individualize it, and we would go, well, this is mine to do with what I want. And that's not how most of history and most of the world operates. Most of the human history and most of the world, even now, operates with a sense of human community. So we depend on each other. You would never say it for most of human history and in most of the world outside of the individualistic world that we live in as Americans. We would never say, this is my little piece and I can do what I want with it and I'm just going to sit on it. Because if you do that, what you're doing is you're only thinking of yourself, and what you are doing is you are harming everyone else by keeping the benefit for yourself. You live a cautious, fearful life. But here's how Jesus says that we can live, is that you live like a faithful steward. You take and you invest your life. So here's the second key, is you have to make your life the investment you make in God's world. Here's what Jesus says. Verse 14, put this money to work, he said, until I come back. Now let me give you 3 places in your life that you can actually take your life and invest it. This is not about you doing something outside your normal life. It's about you taking and redirecting your normal life. In other words, Jesus is not saying, listen, what you need to do is you need to figure out a way to build a nonprofit orphanage in India or your life doesn't amount to anything. Or you need to feed all the homeless in Wichita and eradicate the homelessness problem in Wichita, or you've amounted to nothing. You need to start multiple companies and employ multiple people, or you've amounted to nothing. That's not what Jesus is saying. He says, put to work what you already have, your life. So let me give you 3 places you can put that to work. Here it is. Work. The literal place. Put this money to work. Your job, your vocation, where you go Monday through Friday. Now, we don't talk about this enough in the church. We often, when we talk about work, is secular. You know, it's where I earn my income, but where I get my meaning is when I serve in the church or when I serve in a nonprofit. And that actually does a disservice to the whole understanding of work, because here's what's happening when you are working. You are building something that was not there before, whether that's you have a mop and you're cleaning a floor, and before you got there it was dirty, and so you clean it, and so it wasn't there before, but after you leave and add your value to it, it's clean. Or it's a spreadsheet, it's your career, your job, your investment. That's a fruitful life. It could even be a job that you don't currently love. When you work, you are building something that was not there before. Now, how can I say that? Well, Luke 19:14, put this money to work. he said, until I come back. It's actually almost a recasting of the original pattern from Genesis chapter 1. Here it is. God blessed them and said, notice how it sounds similar, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth, subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea, birds in the sky, over every living creature that moves along the ground. Here's what that means. All of your work is a form of gardening. All your work is a form of gardening. What's gardening? You take the raw material and you use that raw material and you cultivate something that wasn't there before. So let me give you some examples. Say you're in education. What you're doing is you're taking the raw material of the kids that walk into your classroom in the fall. You're taking the raw, all the energy, all the family system issues they bring with them, all of their interest and curiosity. You take that and you take their minds and you take an educational principle and a pedagogy and you combine that together, and what you do is you educate. You create something that wasn't there before. Or if you're in medicine, you take medical knowledge and insight and tools and chemicals, and you combine them with bodies, and you meld them together in your insight, and what you create is you create health. Or say you are a builder. You take trees and the raw material of trees, and you take the raw material in the earth, it becomes metal, and you put them together, lumber and nails, and you put them together, and what do? You create something that wasn't there before. You create a house. If you're in accounting, what you do is you take math and you take spreadsheets and you put them together and you create something where people can flourish financially. Work is gardening, is cultivating the raw material. Now, I know I said job, but I want you to think for a second a little more broadly than that. When we're talking about work, we're not talking about just your job. We are including your job, but not just your job. Meaning anything you do to create something, because that's what work is. It's the creation of something that wasn't there before. Have you ever noticed this pattern? Someone works for 40 years, they retire, and then they go plant a garden. Have you ever considered that? Isn't that interesting? It's almost as if it's put in us to cultivate something. It's the human impulse. Your work is a sign of you living a fruitful life. It's one of the places you take what you have and you invest it in God's world. Benedict, who was a monk in about the 5th century, he looked around. He's famous. He wrote the Rule of St. Benedict. You may have heard of that before. He's kind of responsible for monasteries becoming a thing for the last 1,500 years. And he looked around the world and he realized that people had broken the world into secular and sacred categories. And Benedict saw that we were given this world as creative potential by a creative God who sees potential in us. And he said, listen, that's not the case. There's not a secular world and a sacred world. It's all sacred. So whether you pick up a hammer or whether you pick up a spreadsheet or whether you pick up a plunger or whether you pick up an org chart or whether you pick up a score, all of it is sacred. Here's what that means. That means you can get up every day with every act that you do and you can say, God, here is my act of worship. Everything that you do becomes infused with holiness and it becomes an act of worship. That means when you get up and you mow your lawn and you're not happy about mowing your lawn, like I was not happy about mowing my lawn yesterday, it is still an act of worship to cut the grass and make it beautiful. It all matters. John Henry Newman was a theologian a while ago, and he wrote about St. Benedict, and I want you to hear what he said. He said, St. Benedict found the world, physical and social, in ruins, and his mission was to restore it. Quietly, patiently, gradually. That often, until the work was done, it was not known to be doing. It was a restoration. Silent men were observed about the country or discovered in the forest, digging, clearing, building. And other silent men not seen were sitting in the cold rooms, tiring their eyes and keeping their attention on the parchment while they painfully copied and recopied the manuscripts which they had saved. I'll put this on the screen for you. There was no one who contended or cried out or drew attention to what was going on, but by degrees, the woody swamp became a hermitage, a house, a farm, an abbey, a village, a seminary, a school of learning, and a city. Your work is where you invest your life and live a fruitful life. Second place is your relationships. It's the way you cultivate the relationships that you have. You were made in God's image. You were made in God's Trinitarian image. We say God's a Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, so that at the center of the entire universe is a relationship of love and delight. And out of the relationship of love and delight that is the essence of God, God created everything as an overflow of his creativity and his desire for people to have relationships. So if you've ever wondered why it is when you go to a conference and you meet somebody and you try to make connections and you try to get to know somebody and you want them to know you and you're like, why does that happen? Well, the reason is you were made in God's Trinitarian image. You were made for relationships with other people. If you feel within you a sense that I need other people, and maybe that's not right, that feels needy, that's not a bug, that's a feature. You were made in God's image. You were made to need other people. They were made to need you. For most of my kids' lives, they're a little older now, and so I don't do this as often, but I still will do it when they let me. I would kneel down by their bed, or I would sit down beside them, and we would say the same prayer, I would repeat the same things to them, and then I would kiss them, and I would kiss them 3 times. I'd give them 3 kisses. And I would say this. I'd say, I kiss you 3 times in the name of the Trinity, in whose image you were created for love, joy, and relationships. That's you. You were made that way. So when you cultivate those relationships, those friendships, you're investing your life. I'll give you one place, just talking about children, and just a word to parents. Parents, when you have kids, you are cultivating a person. You are not cultivating a future employer and moneymaker. I hope that happens. You want your kids to be a success, right? You don't want them to be living at home when they're 43. I get it. You are cultivating a person made in God's image, and that is worth your absolute best efforts. You don't have anything more important. That's it. This is a psychologist I follow on Twitter, and this is what he said. I'm going to put it on the screen for you. If every parent took their duty as a parent to be the most sacred responsibility in their life, we could have a thriving culture in 2 generations. In other words, if you invested and cultivated your relationships. Here's the third area. It's your character. It's your character's you. Here's how Dallas Willard said it. The most important thing you and God will get from your life is the person that you become. I've told you this before. David Brooks, writer for the New York Times, he's written several books, but one of my favorites, he said, listen, there's 2 kinds of virtues that we can cultivate. He said we can cultivate what he calls the resume virtues, the accomplishments, the ways, the degrees that I earn, the jobs that I hold, the skills that I possess. He said that's valuable. There's a place for that. He said, but what we really are after, what really it means to be a human being is not just the resume virtues, but what he calls the eulogy virtues. It's the things that people say about you at the end. In other words, it's the kind of person that you were. And so when you invest in who you are, when you say, I'm going to figure out how to be a person of values and vision, and I'm not ever going to give that up. In fact, I'm going to go one deeper, and I'm going to figure out how to be a person of God's values and God's redemptive vision. I'm going to be about Jesus' kingdom values and Jesus' mission to redeem the world. I'm going to make my life about that. I'm going to make my character about that. That's the gift that you give back to God, is the person that you become. In Matthew, notice this, when he tells this same story, he uses talents or bags of gold. And there's the same numbers. There's one servant gets 1 bag of gold, and one servant gets 5, and the other gets 10. And Luke here says they all get 1 mina. But in both Matthew and Luke, I wonder if Jesus told the story a bit differently, and so that's why they wrote it down differently. But in Matthew and Luke, both of all the servants take and they multiply that. The 2 of the servants multiply, and then 1 just keeps it. And so here's what they're understanding, is it's not what you have. It's what you do with what you have. Because what you have is what you have been given. And this is a character insight into God, because he trusts you. He puts into creation a sense of potential. He puts potential in a seed. He puts potential in a tree. God doesn't give you a table. God gives you a tree that you can cut down and turn into a table. The same thing with you. God doesn't give you a life. He gives you a you and says, now do something with that life. Here's my simple way of summing all of that up, those 3 ways of expressing our investment in God's world. Just leave it better than you found it. Just leave it better than you found it. Now here's the third one, and we're going to take communion together. And this is key. You have to understand that grace is the real fuel. You can read a story like this in any of these stories that Jesus tells and assume that what Jesus is doing is telling you how to make yourself acceptable to God. Because the human heart, I think, is kind of like a 6th grade boy who wants to prove themselves. You know, I'm valid. Look at me. Left alone, the human heart believes that justifying my existence is a project that is only up to me. So if I do well, then I will be accepted. And we assume that because that's how we think the world works, that Jesus must be then confirming that. I see. So if I don't live a fruitful life, God will not accept me. That's not what Jesus is saying. If you go right above this story, it's the story of Jesus and Zacchaeus. Most of you grew up, hearing that story of this tax collector, this arch tax collector who defrauded his own people, stole from them. He was, in the words of last week's message, a disrighteous man. He was getting all he could because he thought that's all he could do. He was trying to justify his existence. He didn't know if he was living a fruitful life. God was king because he was religious in name only. But it was after he met Jesus that he turned his resources in God's direction. You and I need what Zacchaeus discovered. Here it is. Jesus didn't come to pronounce blessing on the ones already getting it right. That's not why Jesus came. Jesus came to make right people who were getting it wrong. I need to say that to you again because that needs to sink all the way down into the cracks and crevices in your soul. Jesus did not come to pronounce blessing on the ones already getting it right. I'm already living a fruitful life. God, aren't you impressed? Jesus came to make right the people who were getting it wrong. In the phrase from Genesis chapter 1, to garden us. To correct us, to heal us. I always have this image of what God does with my life, of a trellis. Do you have a trellis outside your house? We have a trellis outside our house. You know what a trellis does? It gives a space for something to grow up and blossom and bloom and be beautiful. And I always think that's what God's doing with our lives. You see, He's the trellis that we grow on so that our deficiencies are corrected and we're healed and we can grow up and we can blossom and we can bloom. And Zacchaeus, to this point in his life, he had bungled all of that. And what Jesus is not saying, this is how you get accepted by living a fruitful life. No, first it starts with grace, and then grace becomes the fuel that you use to live a fruitful life. I'm going to invite you to stand with me. We're going to receive the elements of communion together. And I want to invite you to allow your mind and heart and your life to be converted. And in just a minute, the ushers will release you, and you'll come out this way of your section and come down to the front, receive the elements of communion, and then head back in to your seat. And if you would hold the elements when you receive them in just a moment, and we'll take them all together. But I want you to think as you come forward in just a moment, where you need the change. Do you need the heart ceremony where you, in your heart, okay, God, I'm looking inside, I'm discerning what's there, I'm seeing what's there. I'm gonna anoint you as king over my life. I'm there. Have you recognized that you've not been investing your life? You've just been existing? And this is the moment when you say, God, I want to take my life and I want to invest it. You're going to have to help me. Maybe you simply need to recognize that you need grace for the first time. And so this is an opportunity for you to receive grace as fuel to live the life that God intends for you to live. Whatever it is, I want you to come now as we sing. Would you come as the ushers release you?